for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, strive for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
On March 17th, people all over the world celebrate St. Patrick's Day. That worldwide celebration is a reflection of the global Irish diaspora. St. Patrick is the patron saint of Ireland, and everywhere that the Irish Catholic people ended up making a home after leaving the island, St. Patrick's Day went with them. I heard my Irish Catholic mother say St. Patrick's Day is for the Swedes. Her way of telling me that the American pop culture celebration of St. Patrick's Day had little to do with the realities of being Irish. My mother also told me that she was told by her mother that the British pushed us off the good land and into the rocks. My grandmother referred to the toilet as the throne because she associated the Queen of England with shit. I understand now that was the way that the memory of the brutal legacy of English colonialism trickled down to me. In my 20s and 30s, coming to age in Minneapolis in the resurgent movement to end white supremacy in the United States, I followed those breadcrumbs left to me by my mother and uncle and grandmother into the history of the Irish Catholic diaspora, into the history of my family. Wanting to know more about why we left Ireland, a place we still talk about and celebrate 4, 5, and 6 generations since our ancestors left their homes. I wanted to know, how did we get here? How did we become white Americans? I want to use the occasion of this St. Patrick's Day to share a story from the Irish diaspora that took place here on Turtle Island, in modern-day Texas and Mexico, that gets at some of these questions of white nationalism, white supremacy, American slavery, and international solidarity. The story of St. Patrick's Battalion. El Batallón de San Patricio in the Mexican-American War. El Batallón de San Patricio was a multi-ethnic battalion comprised mostly of Irish Catholics recently forced from Ireland and pressed into service in the U.S. military, who defected from the slave-holding Army of the United States and fought with Mexico to resist American invasion. This company of soldiers fought valiantly alongside the people of Mexico, eventually being caught, captured, and executed by the American government, but creating a bond between the Irish and Mexican nations that remains strong today, and leaving a crack in the white nationalist coalition of American capitalism. In order to understand St. Patrick's Battalion, we have to understand where they came from. Who were they? And what were the conditions that forced them to leave Ireland and led them to choose solidarity with the Mexican peasantry over their Anglo-American officers and manifest destiny? Let's go meet the Irish peasantry of the 1800s. To understand Irish Americans or the British Empire, you must know that the Anglo-American system of settler colonialism was first conceived and implemented in Ireland. In the 1500s and 1600s, the English invaded and conquered Ireland, bringing the Irish-speaking people under the power of the English monarchy. Historical figures like Oliver Cromwell and Sir Walter Raleigh are among the English elite who made their name in murderous campaigns against the Irish, stealing the land and crushing resistance. In the late 1600s, the British launched the settler plantation system, bringing in Protestant settlers from other parts of the British Isles, granting them plots of land to establish plantations, and creating a class of loyalist British overlords that would rule over the landless Irish Catholic masses. The sectarian divide that we still see in Northern Ireland is the result of this settler colonialism. The northern county of Ireland takes its name from the Ulster plantation. This colonial order was enforced through brutal economic, political, and social oppression. The Irish were banned from speaking our own language, following our religious customs. We were barred from owning property and stripped of all sovereignty. By the 1800s, this system of settler colonialism in Ireland had helped to make the British into one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen, and had driven the masses of Irish people into extreme poverty. This is the world the soldiers of St. Patrick's Battalion were raised in oppression that was to come to a ghastly nadir in the Great Famine of the 1840s. In the years 1846 and 1847, between 1 and 2 million Irish people died of starvation and related diseases, roughly a quarter of the population. In that famine period, another 2 to 3 million Irish people fled, many coming to the United States as refugees. If you've heard of this famine, you've probably heard it described as the potato famine, because it was a diseased potato crop that pushed the Irish peasantry over the edge into mass death by starvation. But labeling the Great Famine the potato famine obscures and depoliticizes the reality of the situation, creating the impression that the famine was an accident of nature. The mass starvation was in fact the direct result of English colonialism. Famine was deliberate British public policy. Ask yourself, how did the Irish population become so dependent on a single crop that one blighted potato harvest led to the death of 1 million people in less than 2 years? Even more strange when you realize that potato is from South America and had only been in Ireland for a few centuries. Even more striking is that at the time of the famine and through the duration of the famine, Ireland produced an abundance of cattle and grain. Famine Ireland was the British Empire's leading exporter of beef. The cattle and grain of Ireland fed the wealthy in London, while whole families of Irish peasants died of slow starvation in their homes or openly on the roadside after being evicted. By the 1840s, the land and resources were so colonized by the English landlords, the Irish peasantry had been reduced to reliance on the potato as their sole source of nutrition. The Irish were forced to work the plantations of the English, but not allowed to hold land themselves. Not allowed to raise cattle or grain, not allowed to graze sheep or fish in the seas. All economic activity was controlled by the English. All of the productive potential of the island was directed for export, to make profit for the British plantation owners. To survive, the Irish tenant farmers had to plant potato patches in the rocky soil on the marginal lands they had access to. The potato was so important because it was an exceptionally nutrient-dense food that would grow in the poor soil. Remember, my grandma said they pushed us into the rocks? The conditions of the famine were created by the political economy of colonialism. An oppressed, malnourished indigenous people were hanging on to life through the potato. And when the 1846 crop was struck by a fungus that rendered it inedible, mass death ensued. Famine Ireland horrified those who saw it. There are haunting first-hand accounts describing the hellishness of that period. One American observer described the children he encountered dying of hunger. Quote, "If you take hold of the loose skin within the elbow and lift the arm, it comes away in a large, thin fold, as though you had lifted one side of a long, narrow bag in which some loose bones had been placed. If you place the forefinger of your hand under the chin, in the angle of the jawbone, you find the whole base of the mouth, so to speak, so thin that you could easily conceive it possible with a very slight pressure to force the tongue into the roof of the mouth." End quote. Whole families were found dead huddled in their homes. People were found dead on the side of the road with green-stained lips from frantic attempts to quell their hunger with grass and leaves. The whole duration of this famine, the island was producing far more than enough food to feed its population, but the rules of British political economy strictly forbade interfering in the private markets to relieve the famine. Tons of beef and grain were exported continuously. On top of that, no relief was even allowed to come to Irish ports if not carried on British ships, who used their monopoly to massively inflate the price of entry, again profiting from Irish desperation. Lord George Bentinck, a British official speaking in Parliament, defended British policy during the famine thusly. "I say the government had pursued a wise policy in not interfering with the supply of food in Ireland in any way which could compete with the efforts of private traders." This was British commercial Christianity. When you look closer at the experience of the Great Famine, you see it was also a crisis of mass eviction. The already indebted and poor tenant farmers ate whatever they could save for rent after the potato crop failed, and the landlords showed no mercy. The English government offered no relief of rent obligation. Many thousands of families were pulled out of their humble cottages, which were then pulled down and burned to prevent squatting after the evicting forces left. Families were left to wander the roads, forced into slums of nearby cities, or sent to labor camps where they mostly died of starvation. The mass hunger and housing crisis further compounded into an epidemic of disease. Malnourished people died of diarrhea, cholera, and other gastrointestinal ailments of famine. It's important for us to know that the Great Irish Famine of 1846 was not the only famine the English engineered for its colonial subjects. English imperial capitalism created mass famine in India, the Bengal famine of the 1770s, and the Great Indian Famine of the 1870s, and many more across the empire. Upwards of 15 million Indians died of famine under British rule, some of the worst man-made atrocities in human history. Like the famine in Ireland, the British were exporting the surplus of a rich nation that they had conquered while the indigenous people starved. This is the genocidal stuff that modern capitalism was built on. This famine was a deeply traumatic moment for the Irish people and hugely consequential in Irish history. One of those consequences was to decimate the population of the island. The famine kicked emigration from Ireland into hyperdrive, and that would continue for many decades. It's estimated that 1/3 of the population had died or fled during the famine, but in some counties, that percentage was more like 60 to 70%. Many of the Irish fleeing English brutality came to the United States. The large, urban Irish populations in cities across the country came in good portion from this surge of refugees. This wave of the diaspora also brings us the soldiers who would come to form St. Patrick's Battalion. That's where we're going to leave part one of our special episode celebrating the soldiers of St. Patrick's Battalion. Today we got to meet the Irish peasantry of the 1800s, and we got a sense of the context that these people were fleeing from: English imperialism in Ireland. In part two, we're going to learn about the context that they arrived in: the period of genocidal westward expansion in the United States, the struggle over slavery in the slave-holding American army, and the development of manifest destiny ideology that would lead to the Mexican-American War, where the soldiers of St. Patrick's Battalion would be faced with a choice. Do you fight for the oppressing slave empire, or do you fight with the people for land and for freedom? Money, power, land, solidarity. More than that.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see to keep them coming. Bands